Okay, so today I got my windows open. So if you hear a rooster crowing, that's why. Today I want to share a story about Adoniram Judson, who was considered to be essentially the first Protestant missionary from America. I think he left in 1812, eventually to head to India. Eventually he ended up in Burma, where he spent the next 40 years or so in missionary work there in Burma. He only returned to America once during that entire time. And I'm going to get to that here in a moment. But let me just share a little bit of his background, and I have some things to share with you from two different sources. He was one of the devotionals that I read recently, and I figured, hey, it'd be great to just summarize his life as a devotional thought for us here this today. So Adoniram grew up as the son of a pastor, so he had a good, strong foundation. He was brilliant. He was very incredibly smart. He went to Brown University at the age of 16, graduated first of his class at 19. Now, of course, back then in the 1800s, I think it was 1807. I don't know how large the class size was, but he was very smart. He mastered multiple languages. And he grew up in the household of a pastor. We don't know exactly what his level of training was, because sometimes you can grow up in a very religious house and you can see that it's nothing but religion and it's not relationship, it's not a lifestyle, and that can turn you off. So I don't know the quality of the house, but I know his father was a pastor. Well, he goes off to college, and of course in 3 years, he's surrounded by people who are atheists. And he develops this friendship with this guy named Jacob Ames, who is a deist. Basically, God initiated the creation of the world, but he's no longer active. He's no longer present. He's not an active part. You can't have a relationship with him. And by his 20th birthday, he has basically left the faith altogether. He has no faith. He goes back. He tells his parents, which is heartbreaking, and he basically collects his things and heads to New York to go into the theater business. Well, that is by divine providence. He's kind of turned off by what he sees and what he experiences. He's disgusted, he's dissatisfied, and through a series of events, he goes to visit an uncle, and that's not an experience that he expected, because he actually encounters a young, pious man who's really has strong Christian convictions and is seeking the Lord. And when he's traveling home from this visit, he stops in a small village at a hotel. He's never been there before. And as he checks in, the room keeper basically apologizes because he says, hey, we've got somebody who's critically ill next door. And all night, Adoniram Judson is listening to this individual just groan and gasp and in the throngs of death. And the next morning, he kind of occasionally, just casually mentions, what happened to the man? Is he okay? And the innkeeper says that he passed away in the night. Wow, what was his name? And the innkeeper says, his name was Ames, Jacob Ames. So of all the people, God sovereignly, divinely, providentially orchestrated the lives of two men. They were like best friends in college. And here it is, without either one of them knowing, in an obscure village in the middle of nowhere, at an inn. They get rooms next to one another. And this young man, Jacob Ames, dies. And all that night, Adoniram is listening to the groans of a dying man next door, and it keeps him up all night. It just really wrecks his soul. And when he finds out this was his friend, like the atheist, the deist, Jacob Ames, he spends the rest of the day taking very serious and contemplating death and eternity. And kind of where he stood in his faith. So that was a significant turning point in his life. And it wasn't an immediate thing like the Apostle Paul, but it was a significant turning point. And within the next year or two, he dedicates himself to God. and he applies to be a missionary overseas. And we know from his writings, from his journal, he didn't expect to return to America. In fact, he only returned once in 40 years. He writes to the father of the woman that he was pursuing in marriage, and he basically asks for his daughter. And he says, you will probably no longer see her in this world. We were going to encounter hardships and suffering in the missionary life, exposure to all kinds of dangers, climate of India, insult, persecution, perhaps a violent death, all for the sake of those who are perishing, for immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God. Would you be willing to part with your daughter, knowing that all of this is most likely going to happen? And he is, in fact, married to this lady, and they leave. He's in his early 20s. They leave for India, Burma. And she, in fact, dies on the missions field, and multiple children die on the missions field as well. But the quality of his life was a pity for perishing people and a passion for the reputation of Christ. If your aim is to love people, you will lay down your life to make them eternally glad in God. This is coming from John Piper. If your aim is to glorify Christ, you will also lay down your life to make people eternally happy in God. Now, that was one of the books. During the course of Adoniram's ministry over there, there's the first 12 years. In 12 years, he only made 18 converts in 12 years. He spent years and years not seeing a single person come to Christ at all. He spent a number of years learning the Burmese language and translating the New Testament into Burmese. And after about 10 years, there was a significant time of testing because the Burmese government got into a war with the British government. And even though Adoniram Judson was American, he was confused with the British, Western power. And he was in prison for 17 months. And during that time, he experienced some really significant, we complain about prisons here in America, but we're talking about dead, decaying rats, human excrement, disease, blood, sweat, vomit, just lack of water, rotten food, sick, tortured, dying prisoners, just the horrors, mangled feet. They hung him upside down. The tortures that he saw, long barefoot marches in the sun. He was shackled to bamboo pole and was hoisted up. He was stretched to cut off circulation, bitten by mosquitoes for endless hours. He had the trauma of remembering the screams of the victims and the laughter of the guards, the knives being sharpened, the haunting gong he describes in the different methods of torture, the daily announcement of executions and the threat of execution. So he's in prison for 17 months, and he basically barely survives. He shouldn't have survived, but he did. And during that time, of course, God really, that was a period of schooling for Adoniram Judson. And he survived and later continued on with his missionary work for the next 24 years of his life. So the devotional here says, when we are experiencing trials, it may seem as if they last forever, but they do end, either in death, or, and this is 1 Peter chapter 5, 10 and 11, after you have suffered a little while, God will restore, support, strengthen you, and he will place you on a firm foundation. And so we have this promise of the Lord of suffering for the name of Christ, for those who are totally committed to passionately pursue him and make him known. And it seems as if that the college, the doctorate degree that the Lord is used to administering to his servants, it involves suffering and prison to some degree at some point in a in a minister's life. So I know a lot of the Chinese Christians who've suffered under communism are not really even considered the real deal if they don't have a few years of suffering and torture in the Chinese prisons to back up their faith. They'll be held at an arm's distance because they haven't truly put their faith to the test. And a number of those believers have spent years in prison, and that's where the true essence of their faith is revealed. And that's where the most significant growth has taken place. So we don't exactly have that in America. Some believe that we're headed in that direction. But if you are going to stand firm on the truths and convictions of Scripture and of Christ, in the midst of this culture, the culture is going to come after you, and you will experience persecution. Now, it might not be as significant. It might be a loss of a job, it might be a loss of income, which is a significant thing. It may not be necessarily physical in nature to a high degree like many in other countries. But Jesus did promise suffering and persecution to those who were serious about following him. So I want to read, I wrote this down. Let me read one final quote. Here's what Adoniram Judson said. "A life once spent is irrevocable. It will remain to be contemplated throughout eternity. If it has been a useless life, it can never be improved. It will stand forever and ever. The same may be said of each day when it is past. It is gone forever. All the marks we put upon it, it will exist forever." And how that spoke to me was we only get, each day, do I walk away with a sense that I've truly accomplished a lot for Christ? I've truly, rounds in boxing. Who does the round go to? And in this particular case, is it against me? Is there a mark against me on the day, or is it for me and for Christ and for his glory? Have I trained and discipled my children? Have I led my wife? Have I operated in the character and the spirit of Christ? Have I boldly shared the truth and the gospel? Have I made a difference in this world for Jesus Christ? Or is the opposite true? And there's kind of a negative mark. And I wonder if we just got one positive mark each day or one negative mark, what would be the tally of our life? And he says, on a day-by-day basis, but also once a life is spent, it's irrevocable. You can never get it back. It's contemplated for eternity. If it's been useless, it can never be improved. It has ramifications forever. And that is such a tremendous thought. Only by the grace of Christ can we be disciplined enough to put off worldly temptations and really labor and expend our energies on what matters most. And perhaps that's the challenge from Adoniram Judson's life today. For us not to waste our life, but to give ourselves totally and completely to Jesus Christ and his glory.